So hello, everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are. Thanks for joining us. My name is Hilda Fernandez, co-president of the Lacan Salon and founder member back in 2007. On behalf of the Lacan Salon, I welcome each of you and our wonderful guest today, Dr. Leon Brenner. Before introducing him, I want to acknowledge that the Lacan Salon meets in Vancouver, Canada, sitting on the ancestral and unceded territories of the Musqueam, Tsleil-Waututh, and Squamish peoples. I invite you to visit the Lacan Salon website to check the various activities we host. For example, we are reading Seminar 12 in our ongoing Salon Tuesdays, happening fortnightly in a hybrid model open to all. We will have 2 seminars with Dan Collins. Yeah, if we all close our microphones. We will have 2 seminars with Dan Collins on the week of March 25 to 29. Stay tuned for further details. We will discuss seminar 12 and 13. Apart from these activities, we host this speaker series, cartels, and experimental free associative activities on alternate Tuesdays. So check it in the website. We will have a series of conversations with Corpo Freudiano, a school of psychoanalysis in Brazil and also in France and the US, to explore some ideas about the possibilities of founding a psychoanalytic school here. You can join these discussions. I encourage you to sign in for the listserv by writing to contactlacansalon@gmail.com to be informed of our various initiatives. This event with Leon falls into our speaker series. You can see 2 previous talks on our YouTube channel. We have one video with Danny Novus, another with Alireza Taheri, and you will have the chance to see this one as well. It is my great pleasure to welcome Dr. Leon Brenner, a psychoanalytic theorist and psychoanalyst from Berlin. Brenner's work draws from the Freudian and Lacanian traditions of psychoanalysis, and his interest lies in the understanding of the relationship between culture and psychopathology. His book, The Autistic Subject on the Threshold of Language, is a bestseller in psychology in Palgrave Springer, publishing in 2021. He's a founder of Lacanian Affinities Berlin and Unconscious Berlin, and is currently a research fellow at the International Psychoanalytic University Berlin and the Hans Killen and Lotte Kohler Zentrum at the Rotter Universität Bochum. Today, Leon will be delivering a talk entitled From Science to Signifiers, Art and Language in Autism. He recommended us to read his rich text, The Autistic Pseudo-Signifier, Imaginary Dialectization of Science in the Clinic of Autism. These are very important developments, crucial for those who work with people with neurodivergencies, specifically with autism. Dr. Brenner will walk us through his theoretical articulation that departs from the Lacanian aphorism that the unconscious is structured as a language, and he will articulate how signs differ from signifiers in the development of language of the subjects with autism, and how that is a way in which the autistic individual bypasses the necessity of a symbolic other. But let us hear from Leon himself and help me to welcome him. Go ahead, Leon. Welcome.
Thank you, Hilda. It was much lovelier seeing you here in Berlin a few months ago. So yeah. It's still lovely. And also very nice to see faces that I'm used to seeing. And I've already said hello to Nathan, Rosanne, and Manuel, of course, Madeline. It seems like we see each other every week or every day of the week, huh? Good. So I'm really looking forward to speak to you all. I'll just say in advance that I really don't like sending text prior to a lecture. I usually send a text after the lecture, but still, I was happy to comply. And whoever read the text, that's fantastic. So you'll be more, let's say, well endowed in what I'm going to speak about. I promise I'm not gonna venture into the use of jargon, and if I do use concept, I will explain what I mean. So this lecture is aimed to present to you some interpretation of the work with autistic people that is Lacanian, but you do not have to be a Lacanian in order to take part in it. I don't know, Hilda, are we recording the spotlight, only the two of us, or are we recording everyone?
I have you in my kind of, you are the speaker view.
Right. Okay. So
Yeah.
just to tell everyone that if you want to show your face, that would be nice. And I think that I will be the only one recorded. So that's a relief. But I am following your faces. So I'm now seeing some of you smile. So that's a bad sign for me. Let's
it creates a more interactive, more kind of a presence.
I only want frowny faces and angry faces. This is all. I'm joking, but let's begin. So today I want to speak to you about a topic that sits, we might say, in the intersection of developmental psychology, which has in a way monopolized the research on autism, and psychoanalytic theory. And we're going to be focusing on the specificities of language and speech development in the context of autism. And we'll focus on one specific dimension of that. I can tell you that my work on autism focuses on this dimension, but tries to provide different perspectives and aspects in the, that we can identify within the autistic linguistic structure, let's say, or use of language. So the discussion will touch upon Lacanian psychoanalysis, and I want to provide you with, let's say, a nuanced clinical perspective on the work with autistic patients, and particularly in an artistic content. So Hilda has asked me to provide maybe some examples and speak about the clinic as well. So we will do that. So to begin, it's critical to acknowledge that, and I emphasize this here, specificities. Some people call it, I don't know, developmental disorders, or let's say, any type of disorder or setback, but we'll look at these as specificities in language and speech development, are not only central to the diagnosis of autistic people, but also significantly influences their prognosis. And here I speak about psychological assessments of autism. And we can say then that these linguistic specificities are the hallmark of autism. They shape the way we understand and approach this condition, especially within the psychoanalytic perspective that I want to present to you today. And in exploring these specificities, we turn today to the Lacanian orientation, which offers, I think, a compelling framework for understanding the challenges that autistic people face in their daily life. And from this perspective, the difficulties in language and speech development that we observe in autism are viewed as symptomatic manifestations. So they have a deeper, let's say, underlying cause. And the cause that I'll speak about a little bit today is characterized in my work as a spontaneous refusal on behalf of the subject to engage with the language of others, or more specifically, the refusal of what we call alienation in language. And now I'll explain what alienation is, because it's a concept, so we're gonna delve into it. So generally, alienation is a concept that you will see in many studies, academic studies, but it's also particularly elaborated by Lacan in his teaching. And I will try and simplify it now for the purpose of today, and speak to you about the moment of entry into language, the moment, let's say we assume this is some type of a myth I'm going to give you, the moment the human baby enters language. So in order to contextualize alienation, we have to first of all consider a fundamental vulnerability of human infants. And this is the fact that at birth, humans are quite uniquely ill-equipped to enter this world, and they entirely rely on their caregiver for their survival. And we think about this relationship, and I think that Melanie Klein thought about that a lot, this relationship between the baby and whatever is there to assist it in its survival or its demise. But when we think about this type of relationship already existing, let's say in the womb, so the baby, the psyche is already at work in the womb, we assume that when the baby is in the womb, this this caretaker, constantly, let's say, meets the instinctual needs that the baby has. So in the womb, there is no need that is not instantaneously answered. But this reality clearly shifts dramatically when a baby is born, right? So we should agree that invariably there will be moments when an infant needs something, but their needs will go unmet. So for example, the baby is crying, the baby is hungry in the middle of the night, but the caregiver is still asleep. They don't know. They don't watch the baby and make sure they're not hungry every moment. And we see these moments of frustration, moments where a need is not answered, as moments where a lack is introduced into the child's psychic economy. Now, what does this lack compel the child to do in many cases? And as we will see in the case of autism, maybe not so much. This lack compels the infant to cry, as we know. And Lacan speaks about the cry in several places in his teaching, and he assumes that the cry is not merely a communicative act. Right? So it's not there only to communicate something, that it is fundamentally, regardless of the content that it communicates, it is fundamentally an appeal to the other. Now we're going to understand this as the other, as the caretaker, as the caregiver, as I have previously said. In a second, we're going to mix it up a little bit. So there is an appeal to the other, and the cry by itself, regardless of the meaning conveyed within it, is an appeal to the other. So this means that before it serves any explicit communicative purpose, the cry signifies the baby's initial demands, and it articulates and directs them towards the other, the caregiver in this context. And the cry aims, by doing that, by appealing to the other, it aims to alleviate the intense discomfort caused by an unmet need. Now, as we delve deeper into this exploration of language in autism, it's important to clarify some foundational concepts, as I will say, and now we will try and clarify the concept of the big other now, the other that I'm speaking about. So if you open Lacan's teaching, you'll see that his work is quite rich and multifaceted, and in this sense, he offers numerous definitions of the concepts that some of you might know, the concept of the big other. It's big because we write it with a big O. For our current discussion, we will focus on a particular interpretation of the other. And this is the other that should be understood as a place, as a locus of language that exists prior to the individual and is introduced to the individual as they begin to engage with language. And I'll even say more specifically, it is the realm of language that is shared by individuals within a particular culture, where units of meaning shape psychic reality on a collective and personal level. So now we have this big other, and now you sort of are with me when I say the other. So we can take another step in our understanding of alienation and the entry into language. So the first introduction into language marks a significant transition from the subject, because it creates a divide between what is intimate, we might say, for the sake of our discussion, we might say what is nonverbal, instinctual, unmediated experience of the body, and the realm of meaning, of words, and the influence that language has on our instinctual and bodily experience. And this division that Lacan speaks about is not merely conceptual. It's not only a concept, it is an experience. And it can be deeply painful and at times traumatic. It splits what might be considered as the wholeness of experience. And it compels the subject to navigate two incommensurable realms simultaneously. So it is somewhat of an impossibility also that is assumed by the subject. Now, what is interesting is that when Lacan speaks about the cry, so when Lacan speaks about the baby vocalizing its first demands in an appeal to the other, he says that it experiences this type of pain exactly due to this alienating function of language, this thing that creates a split, a divide. And this alienation, it manifests across several distinct levels, but I'll try and sort of intuitively present them to you today. So when the baby takes on language in an appeal to the other, the baby attempts to translate something of its intimate instinctual dynamics, what we might call the raw vivacity of the body, into a linguistic utterance. And this linguistic utterance will inevitably fall short of fully capturing these experiences. So whatever is expressed and is supposed to be the representation of this, let's call it a pain, a lack, an unsatisfied need, will never express it. So the saying is always alienating on this level. In doing so, the baby also relies on a language that precedes its existence, and it belongs to the other. What do I mean here? It is a language that is there before we are born. We get a name. Our parents even think about our name. They fantasize about us. They already put us somewhere in this language before we are even born. And when we make a cry as an appeal to the other, we have to make a cry that is understood by the other, that is understood as a cry, as an appeal. For instance, if the baby only thinks about food, the parent probably would not come and feed it. So the baby has to be resourceful to take on a language that belongs to the other. And this is also an alienating factor. And finally, and this is the most profound level, I think, and maybe the most complex or difficult to understand, is the fact that when the baby appeals to the other through its cry, the baby then retroactively constitutes the other as the source from which its needs can be met. So its own needs, its own most instinctual dimension, intimate dimension, is bestowed upon an other place. It is only there that the baby can find an answer to this particular lack or pain. And this, again, further entrenches this position of alienation within language. So I hope that somewhat ring the bell for some of you. Now, Bruno Bettelheim, who's a psychoanalyst who's known to write a lot about autism. I know he's also in quite a scandalous figure, but his book, The Empty Fortress, I think is a very interesting one. And he builds up on a similar intuition, and he argues that autistic people experience a certain initial moment in their life as a moment of extreme helplessness, perceived as unpredictable, life-threatening, and inescapable. What I want to suggest to you today is that the alienation in language is exactly this experience. For all of us, the alienation in language, it doesn't matter who you are, where you come from, what language you speak. It is traumatic, well, exactly due to these three dimensions that I've presented to you today. But the question is, how does the subject react to this? And what I suggest to you today is that for autistic subjects, the alienation within language is not just unbearable, it also feels life-threatening and even mutilating. And this brings us to a critical point in Lacanian theory, where autism is seen as a radical refusal, right? A refusal not merely of another person, right? Because clearly autistic people do have other people in their lives. But it is a refusal of the big other, as the locus of signifiers, the domain of shared cultural symbols and meanings. So the subject refuses the alienation in this domain, a refusal to engage in an intimate way, to inhabit the language of the other, which is the domain of signifiers that bind the culture together, is a fundamental aspect of autism. But what I will try and work with you today is on this idea that this does not mean that autistic people are exiled from language. They may refuse access to the domain of signifiers, but in my work, I argue that they do engage with language through a different linguistic unit called the sign. And this alternative mode of engaging with language, well, it underscores the complexity and diversity of autistic experience, and it also challenges us to rethink our assumptions about language, about communication, and about human connection. This is what I think in general, but we'll deal with a particular aspect of that today. So in order to enhance our understanding of the unique way autistic people access language, we'll first examine the linguistic differentiation between the signifier and the sign. It is discussion that requires a deep dive into Lacanian theory and also into a theory of linguistics called semiotics, but I'll provide you with a brief overview with some examples to underscore my argument. So a sign, what is a sign? A sign is a direct, it is a linguistic unit that represents a direct biunivocal relationship between a sensory form and a referent. So for example, the smell of smoke acts as a sign of fire. The image of a person on a dollar bill refers to this person in this life. It is a sign for this person. So you see there's a direct relationship between a sensory form, be it smell or something that you see, and the referent. That is the characteristic of a sign. And it's quite a straightforward way of conveying meaning. Now, today, linguists don't think that language is composed out of signs. They think of it as being composed out of signifiers. A signifier is not a particular picture or smell that has a direct relationship with an object. A signifier is fundamentally a phonological element. It's like a sound, like a ba, do, ah in a word, right? It reminds us of a baby's babbling. So these are basic vocal articulations that in isolation don't refer to any object or don't have any specific meaning, right? Like, it doesn't really refer to anything. But when we oppose several signifiers, one against the other, then we have what we call signification, or the signified emerges. And what I want to suggest to you today is that human beings typically interpret these signifiers within a complex of oppositions, and only then conceive of them in their minds of the signified. So, we have this opposition between the words, let's say, psychoanalysis, right? And when I say these signifiers one next to the other, you conceive of this word. But if I start saying psycho, you might think that I'm referring to something else. I need to finish the chain of signifiers in order for you to conceive what I have to say. Now, this means that the signifiers have this fluid nature that allows meaning to shift and contextualize in different contexts and circumstances, and also tonalities. So I'll give you two examples in order to stress my point. Here's an example about contextuality. So if I say this sentence, I can't believe that you did that. Yeah. In one context, it might refer to a type of admiration. I can't believe that you did that, right? For example, if a friend completes a difficult task, right? We're surprised and we praise the person. But it can also mean disappointment in a different context, right? If someone behaves in a way that is against expected norms or values. I can't believe that you did that. It can also be sarcastic. It might be used to mock or belittle an achievement or action that I would actually find trivial or unworthy of genuine praise. And it could also signify a confusion on my behalf, or a lack of understanding as to why someone would perform a particular action. So you see, the same words have a different meaning in different contexts. And I will have you an example of tonality. I'm going to say the same sentence 7 times, and you'll see that each time I would mean something else. So first, I never said we should kill him. 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 And I never said we should kill him. So you see the emphasis, the tonality in my speech, each of the times it was the same sentence, the same words, but some of you have picked up on the fact that I was referring to something completely different. So signifiers, this is how they work. And we said that the big other is the place of signifiers, the locus of signifiers. It is a repository where all the oppositional formations of signifiers are maintained in a specific culture and historical context. And by eschewing access to this domain of signifiers and relying only on signs, autistic language then differs significantly from a language based on signifiers. And how so? Well, first in terms of referentiality, right? Signifiers have no referent other than other signifiers. But signs are linked to a referent. They establish a permanent connection to a referent. So a word would mean one thing. It couldn't mean something else in different contexts. Second is intersubjectivity. The relationship between signifiers are derived from the big other. So from the set of signifiers that are shared by individuals in culture. But signs have to be adopted personally. Their validity is determined by the individual, and it doesn't necessarily shared with others. Lacan speaks about this story where one's mistress would leave a vase of flowers on the window to show her lover that she's ready for lovemaking. But this is something that only they knew. It is a sign that is only fathomed by the individual. Then fluidity. The relationship between signifiers is contextual. It evolves over time. It changes in different situations. But the sign's relation to the referent is fixed and is only established under specific circumstances. And then finally, and this will be our next topic, there's something that I would call a rigid tangibility in the use of signs. So the fluidity of the signifier, it facilitates the expression of concepts that are a bit ambiguous, abstract, general. But the link between a sign and a referent, this rigid link, limits the ability of the sign to convey a meaning that is not precisely tied to a specific object in the world. So due to this difficulty, we see that a language that is comprised of signs resembles something like a code. It's constructed from fixed sets of signs and reference, like a matrix. And this proves to be challenging in encoding general concepts, ambiguity, and abstractions. And this is what we see in autism. This is exactly what we see in autism. And I'll give you some examples from the difficulties that autistic people have with coding and understanding complex concepts. So let's begin with general concepts. We start with Solomon Cherchevsky, who is an autistic mnemonist and mathematician. And Cherchevsky shares his difficulty in reconciling that terms like pig and sow refer to the same animal. This challenge is also echoed in the work of Donna Williams, who is also an autistic writer. And she says that cow ceases to be identifiable as such when characterized as part of a flock. So these examples highlight a fundamental aspect of autistic language, the struggle to generalize from specific instances to broader categories. And this process typically occurs seamlessly in non-autistic individuals. Let's speak about ambiguous concepts. So Temple Grandin, who's an autistic writer and an academic, she speaks about her difficulty with language elements that lack clear and concrete reference. So adjectives like over and under, verbs such as jumping, pronouns like the, it, they become unclear when they're stripped of their context. So over the table, I'm jumping over the table, that makes sense. But what does jumping mean? Right? What does jumping mean in isolation? We might philosophize, we might think about it, we might able to hold this concept in our mind, to do some mental gymnastics, but for Grandin, this is quite an impossible. And finally, abstract concepts, which I think are extremely interesting. This is a realm where the tangible meets the intangible. So Grandin recounts her challenge with concepts like peace or honesty. These are concepts that lack a direct physical representation. There is no object in the world that we can say is peace. In the same way, Cherchevsky, who is a genius mathematician, says that he is unable to deal with notions like infinity or nothing. So these experiences shed light on the autistic experience of abstract reasoning, and it reveals a preference for the concrete and observable. Now, what I want to stress today and take a few steps further with you today is the fact to demonstrate that many autistic people do develop a deep understanding of complex concepts, particularly through their memorizing skills and the manipulation of signs. And this will be our topic. And a compelling example for this can be found in the work of Temple Grandin, who is known to have extraordinary memorizing skills, and she's also very well in manipulating mental imagery. So she says that she can navigate the complex language of language using iconic signs. So these are signs that are images. And Grandin describes in her book, Thinking in Pictures, which is a book about this, how she studies images in a photographic manner. She memorizes written pages or artworks. And later she goes on in her mind to rearrange these memorized images and to form new constructs. And she says this is something like using a computer graphic editor. She can play, superimpose, rotate, and animate these images to create complex imaginary constructs. Now, Grandin says that when she accumulates groups of pictures and manipulates them in a way that she finds appealing, then they form picture categories that then can correspond to word categories, which finally facilitate the formation of concepts. Now, this is contrasted to non-autistic individuals, particularly in their approach to conceptualization and generalization. So, non-autistic children, they generalize from the outset. They move from broad categories to specific distinctions. So, they think that everything is a chicken, and then you have to tell them, no, this is a chicken, but this is a duck. It's two different things. And then this is how they learn more and more words. But Grandin's process is reversed. Right? She starts with specific instances. She says, like recalling every Great Dane she has ever seen in her life to conceptualize the general category Great Dane. This specific, she does this, let's say, she builds up towards generalization when finally she has a multitude of pictorial proper names of Great Danes, and then she collects them together and represents them with a particular word, a dog. So for Grandin, she goes over every Great Dane she's ever seen in order to conceive of this general concept dog. Now, this is even more fascinating, how Temple Grandin codes abstract concepts. So for instance, the concept peace. So she encodes it through images of doves, Indian peace pipes, or footage of a peace treaty signing. Honesty is symbolized by the act of placing one's hand on the Bible in court, or through news reports of acts of honesty she remembers, such as returning a wallet, for instance. And this method of visualizing abstract concept through concrete images allows Grandin to integrate these concepts into her understanding, and it showcases a unique pathway to language and concept formation in autism. Now I'll give you the Lacanian take on this. Because I think viewing this from a Lacanian perspective offers us a fascinating lens through which we can understand concept formation, particularly in the context of autism. So this perspective frames Grandin's process as what I call an imaginary dialectization of signs. It suggests a potential pathway also in the psychoanalytic engagement with autistic patients, as you'll see. Now, dialectization is, we might say, a cornerstone of Lacanian psychoanalytic technique, particularly when working with neurotic patients. And it involves highlighting certain signifiers that Lacan calls master signifiers. And I'll give you a brief description of what this means. These are signifiers that come back again and again in the patient's discourse. They hold a disproportionate importance in the discourse. They have a significant value, and their validity is usually unquestioned. Right? So they emerge particularly in response to areas within one's discourse where, let's say, elements in one's life, or I might say libidinal elements, cause a fundamental distortion. So basically it means they appear where discourse fails to encapsulate the subject's experience. So these signifiers can be things like death, embarrassment, narcissism, autism. And these signifiers tend to curtail the chain of association, the chain of associative thinking, rather than expand it. So the patient keeps coming to them instead of freely associating. They keep telling the same story again and again, the story that they told a million times before, instead of telling it in a different way. Now, the process of dialectization in the psychoanalytic treatment involves the symbolic opposition of terms that facilitate the emergence of a third term that transcends this fixation on a single master signifier. In this sense, dialectization promotes a movement within the signifying chain. Now, when a master signifier is dialectized, it allows the subject to adopt a new position in relation to their discourse. So they're not stuck on this anymore, and they move beyond the opacity of the master signifier to, let's say, maybe articulate its personal significance or something like that. Now, what I argue is that Grandin's method of constructing what we might term as pseudo-concepts, right? These complex concepts, these pseudo-complex concepts, through the manipulation of iconic signs, is a process of dialectization. But instead of focusing on master signifiers, Grandin works with iconic signs. Right? Remember, the challenge for autistic people lies in encoding signs that lack a clear referent, particularly when dealing with general, ambiguous, and abstract concepts. Now, what Grandin does is she overcomes this by establishing relationships between multiple iconic signs to create an iconic category that serves as the referent for this original sensory form, whatever concept one might discuss in relation to it. Now, this method, it effectively generates a new concept that transcends the accumulation of signs that are involved within it. Right? It is not about 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 Great Danes. It's about the collection. It's not about shaking hands, a peace pipe. All of these symbols in isolation don't mean peace. But for Grandin, when they come together, then we have a concept. Now, I want to highlight something that Grandin highlights in her book. And this is the fact that this process of constructing iconic signs or new iconic categories through dialectization is transformative. It's not merely, it doesn't merely result in a quantitative increase in the amount of signs that she has. Rather, she says it engenders a qualitative shift that enriches her whole perspective. It makes a meaning that is greater than the sum of its parts. And this qualitative effect, she says, is not just significant, it's meaningful, comprehensive, and pivotal in altering Grandin's subjective position in her biography. So when Grandin speaks about these moments, she likens them to a process of getting a new version of software for the computer. This is a quote from Grandin. So we see this analogy, it underscores a profound impact, a conceptual revision, like a software update that marks a period of subjective transition and significant change in her life. And such updates are not just adjustments, they represent transformative shifts in her understanding of the world. So these autistic pseudo-concepts have a profound impact on autistic subjects. And Grandin cannot be clear in stressing that. And this is why I suggest calling them pseudo-signifiers. Because in composing them, in creating them, we see that the autistic subject gains an access to the dynamic of the signifier, a dynamic that was lacking, let's say, in the sole recourse to the sign. And in this sense, we might say that it allows the autistic subject to achieve some level of access to the function of the signifier. It is not the signifier. This is a little dispute I have with a colleague of mine called Jean-Claude Maleval, who is, I think, one of the greatest scholars writing about autism in Lacanian orientation. For him, it is the signifier. For me, it's a pseudo-signifier. Okay, it's a silly discussion. But what we see is that the pseudo-signifier is a catalyst for significant shifts in perception and understanding that is analogous to the role of the master signifier in Lacanian psychoanalysis. But it's particular to autism. And now I want to give you some clinical examples for this kind of work. So in my clinical work with autistic analysis, I've advocated for an approach that emphasizes the, let's say, enhancement of language use to facilitate the autistic individual's relationship with their body, with knowledge, with the social bond, with social connection. And central to this approach is the engagement with the pseudo-signifier, focusing on identifying and working through points of conceptual encoding stoppage by leveraging the autistic affinity with signs. And I'll make a side note here that is important for me to make for the sake of many autistic people who contacted me and commented on this. And we see this comment also in Temple Grandin's book, because, you know, autism is a spectrum, and that means many, many things. And Grandin says that there's a diversity of thinking styles among autistic individuals. And she speaks about visual thinkers like herself, music and math thinkers who perceive the world in patterns of sounds and numbers. There are verbal logical thinkers who excel in processing word details and structured information, and more. Yes. So this diversity suggests that each type of autistic thinker has the potential to develop unique methods of constructing pseudo-signifiers, like Grandin's visual thinking approach, by using a different modality of the sign. So it doesn't have to be an iconic sign. It can be a sign that has to do with image, with math, with verbal logic, etc. Today, I'm giving you examples of working with iconic sign, particularly in the context of working with art. So in my practice, I've observed moments where engaging with these pseudo-concepts, these pseudo-signifiers, opens a new dimension of conceptual richness for autistic individuals. And these moments, it seems to me, coincide with personal crisis or loss, where a sign's established link to its referent is disrupted, and this would challenge its referentiality. And these moments would compel the subject to confront the limitation of an orderly system of knowledge, prompting them to invest in novel methods of conceptual encoding. And these inventive processes would involve sometimes the dialectization of signs, creating oppositional formations of signs that transcend the conventional sign-referent dynamic. So here are some examples. I think I will take about 10 more minutes, something like that. Here are some examples. So a basic example can be found in the work of Nicole Martin, who does a lot of work on art therapy in the context of autism. And she introduces a particular framework for art therapy with autistic patients that is designed to foster flexible thinking and the ability to encode abstract concepts into their vocabulary. Just a side note, none of my examples other than my own would be an example that is psychoanalytic. So these are art therapists that are not psychoanalytically informed, but I do identify the psychoanalytic insight that I presented to you in their work. So we'll use their work. So Martin posits art as a dual purpose tool in this context, as a literal and a figurative drawing board for the mind's images. And through art projects that encourage the creation of personal symbols that reflect the child's interests or emotions, she explores the development of abstract representation. She says that key to this therapeutic approach is the observation and support of the child's favorite themes, materials, and engagement duration, and assessing their activity from, let's say, least to most independent. This is how she works. Now, this process enables the child to invent independently within the transference I added here, leading to the creation of non-figurative or abstract representation that utilize art elements like color, composition, and placement. And Martin emphasizes the importance of associating abstract elements with specific meanings. So to associate blue with coldness, for instance, jagged lines with frustration. This is how she works. Until a title can be assigned to the artwork as a whole. And this is where things become more important for me. She gives an example from a work with a 3-year-old autistic child who created several clay figures, each representing a memory recalled object. And he names them accordingly. I have this image. Hilda, maybe I can share it. Can I share the screen?
Absolutely. I'm gonna make you host right away. Yeah, it's a very good one to show, actually. Yeah.
Yes, I'll show it. So as soon as you
yeah. Make host. Okay. Yes. Yeah, you can
okay.
share.
Here it is. So I'll speak about it as you're viewing it. This is the artwork that I'm speaking about. So we see the child names it cupcake with candle, cake with candle, ice cream cone. Now, this act of naming not only opens possibilities for interpreting new objects and understanding relationships between them, but as she says, it serves as a foundation for psychic change. So in this case, and I'm highlighting what is more important for my discussion, after naming his clay creation, the child arranges them into a montage and he calls it birthday party. He gives it a title. And this activity enables him to encode the concept of a birthday party into his vocabulary, simultaneously addressing and consolidating any anxiety-related memory of his own birthday party, where the therapist sees that these objects were derived from. So we see here an act of giving a title, of giving an abstract title for a set of structures, of artistic structures. And I say here we see a dialectization of science. Another example from Melinda Emery, another therapist working with autistic children. She works with an autistic child who draws a picture of his favorite restaurant, and he represents it with a McDonald's sign with the large arches. She compels the child to progress to a more complex description and then illustrate the exterior of the restaurant, including the little playhouse there. The therapist guides the child through questions about his visit to the restaurants, and she prompts the child to include additional elements to this experience, also his journey with his mother. And despite some initial struggles, the child successfully draws a car and the figures that represent himself and his mother. And then he takes all of these drawings that were separate and he arranges them side by side, and he decides to connect them all with a ground line. It goes across the edges of the pages. And this act of creating and connecting multiple images marks a significant moment for the child. It allows him to contextualize and relate separate images for the first time. And the therapist reflects on this progression. She notes that it's a milestone in the therapy, and she says there was substantial growth following that. What I found interesting is the culmination of this therapeutic journey is when the child creates a booklet filled with drawings of his favorite restaurants, and he gives it as a gift to the therapist. And this gesture not only symbolized the therapeutic advances he made, but also represents his ability to share his interests and experience in a meaningful and connected way. Finally, I'll briefly give you an example from my own practice. It comes from my work with an adult autistic person who's a genius model and logician, really outstanding genius, who initially believed in the quantifiability of everything, and particularly was interested in the question of beauty and its correlation with romantic success. So what we saw in the work is that this patient would invent extremely complex formulas that would explain human interactions and would provide him with outcomes for his own actions. And I have to say, these were quite good. These were very, very impressive in their capacity to predict human behavior. The work in our engagement in the analysis was to, let's say, softly encourage the patient to reconsider this linear model by constructing, through dialectization, new concepts, and I'll particularly speak about a concept of charisma. And this factor was not easily quantifiable. Mm-hmm. And from this sort of insistence and hard work on this, his model was expanded from a linear model to what I would call an asymptotic model, a model that is most of the time predictable, but at one point it doesn't provide us with an answer. Mathematicians might have an intuition here, but trust me on this one. Basically, this is what we mean, what I mean by it. And this process not only enriched the patient's conceptual framework clearly, but also facilitated a transition from a rigidly defined sign system to a more nuanced signifying domain, embodying a shift from the asymptotic, as I say, to an acceptance of incompleteness. I mean, the analysis ended at a point where the patient formalized a formula for inconsistency, meaning a formula for what is not established in a formula, what a formula cannot express. So it was a formula that results, that doesn't give us a number, but gives us and does not compute. The analysis ended quite quickly after that. So let me summarize. And as I do, I'll also criticize other particular forms of engagement with icons in the treatment of autism, and particularly those associated with the applied behavior analysis framework. So there is this thing called PECS, Picture Exchange Communication System, that is widely recognized for teaching language skills to autistic children. And it's grounded in behaviorist principles that link a stimuli to reward and a sign to a referent with a structured learning framework. And its primary goal is to demonstrate that icons, well, to demonstrate to the autistic child, that icons can serve as a tool for communication, allowing children to express desires, to respond to requests, to comment on their surrounding through this pictorial exchange. Now, what I want to argue right now in the end of this talk is that the approach that we see with Temple Grandin, the approach that I borrow from her, that I developed thanks to her in Lacanian terms, this approach to developing pseudo signifiers, it remarkably diverges from the linguistic skills that are fostered by PECs and similar methods. First, Grandin's process involves a nuanced engagement with signs that inherently lack a direct referent, right? PECs is about signs that have a direct referent, but Grandin is working with signs that lack a direct referent, and she integrates them into a personal vocabulary through a complex interplay of iconic signs that are tied to significant life events and personal meanings. So this is an idiosyncratic method that resists the imposition of predetermined schemas for conceptual encoding. And in this sense, it necessitates a tailored case-by-case approach. Now, unlike methods that focus on the direct association between sign and referent, we see that Grandin's technique operates at the level of the signifier itself, right? It bypasses the need for semantic correlation or dictionary definition, right? She is not searching for the meaning of a dove in the dictionary and then saying, oh, that will make sense for my composing of this concept of peace. No, she is building a signifying chain using iconic signs regardless of their contextual meaning, regardless of their semantic meaning, sorry. Now, this aspect of Grandin's method highlights its distinctiveness in affecting the autistic individual's subjective position, right? It is unique to her. It is about her. And this outcome, well, it's not targeted by ABA-based language acquisition models. They typically exclude considerations of subjectivity and personal and agency in general. So these conventional frameworks, well, by predetermining what knowledge is deemed as appropriate for the child, they often overlook these unique processes and creative solutions that autistic individuals naturally employ. Well, maybe with a little assistance, with a little gentle push. And this can lead, the fact that it does not only overlook these creative solutions, but also sometimes prohibits them. This can lead to, well, a diminishment of their agency and ingenuity, and sometimes lead to moments that autistic people describe as being tormenting. And in contrast, the psychoanalytic approach that is exemplified by Grandin's method, well, it aims to preserve and enhance the subject's agency by recognizing and valuing their unique ways of understanding the world. And the profound subjective effect that Grandin describes, this transformative impact of the pseudo-signifier on her perception and interaction with her body, with the world, well, this underscores basically the goal of psychoanalysis. Right? Psychoanalysis transcends mere pedagogy. It aims to affect the individual at a level that we call the level of the drive, but we might say the level of the body, of their place within the humanized world. Now, this effect, it is central to the psychoanalytic treatment of autism, and it highlights the importance of approaches that honor and leverage the autistic individual's unique capacities. Now, again, today I gave you examples that were not from the clinic of psychoanalysis, and I speak about these as well. But what I want to maybe end with is that this particular assessment or perspective that I gave you on this work, well, it demonstrates, I think, the crucial role the psychoanalysis has in fostering meaningful and transformative engagement with language, particularly in the treatment that is offered to autistic people. And this is why it's so important for me to speak with you about this today, that you might think that it's a good idea, and then you might be able to work in a more profound way with your autistic patients. And I'll end here.
Great. Thank you, Leon. Now we are going to move into questions and answers. So I see Nathan has his hand, then Juan Luis, and there's one question in the chat. So do you want to go about like, and then Hamid is the one that put some question in the chat. Leon, do you want to have like several questions, or you answer one by one?
Let's do it like an analysis, one by one.
One by one, yeah. I'm of the other kind. Like I like. Okay, so one by one. Nathan, then Juan Luis, then Hamid.
Thank you, Hilda, and thank you, Leon, for a very interesting series of remarks. I was actually trying to use the clapping emoji reaction, but I do have a question, as it turns out. So if you don't mind, I'd like to return to your notes on the difference between a signifier and a sign. I am in particular interested in the notion that a sign carries with it a referent. Because it seems to me, or at least from my understanding, this is precisely not the case in a kind of classical Saussurian structural conception of the sign, which contains both signifier and signified, both of which he says are purely psychological phenomena, and that the referent is absent from the system of language, which is what makes a sign arbitrary, which makes meaning negatively and differentially defined. So my question has to do with where you are locating this notion of, as you put it, the fixed or rigid link between the sign and the referent. Is that, on your reading, a fact of language, or does it bear particularly on the autistic subject's experience of language, in particular in relation to the conception of the big other that you introduced?
Right. Nathan, this is a great clarifying question, especially to those who have studied semiotics and have read Ferdinand de Saussure. Yes, de Saussure uses the term sign differently than the way Lacan uses it. Completely differently. And I might even comment that Lacan is not very consistent in using it. So sometimes he is de Saussurean, and sometimes he relies on Charles Sanders Peirce's definition of the sign. And this is the definition that I was speaking about today. Not as a sign as this unit that is composed of the signifier and the signified. No, this is not what I was referring to, and de Saussure definitely uses the term sign there. But what Charles Sanders Peirce develops as a sign theory, and you know, for him, there's this idea that a sign is well, something that anything which is determined by something else that we call its object and has an effect on a person. For Lacan, the definition of a sign is it means something for another, and he says the subject is not there. The subject is not included in this definition. So basically, we're speaking about the question of what is the concept of a sign. And to your question, I'm not referring to Ferdinand de Saussure's definition of the sign. Then nothing I said today would make any sense. I'm referring to Charles Sanders Peirce and the way that Lacan interprets it, particularly in his 9th seminar on identification. And in this seminar, the sign is really relegated to a status of a lesser, let's say, linguistic unit. Lacan even says that sign language is something that animals use. So for him, it is the human language is a language of signifiers. We have some poor animals that we bring into the fold, you know, that they suffer from our malaise because we bombard them with signifiers. And then there's the wild animals that are animals that use signs. And, you know, he gives the example of the red robin, for instance, right? The red robin has a red breast. That is a sign for a particular gender and particular sexual act, etc., etc. So for Lacan, this would be a sign. And rightfully so, we need to distinguish that. So thanks for that, Nathan.
Sorry, I'm mute. So we have Juan Luis, then Hamid, then Hilda, then Manuel. Okay, Juan Luis.
Hi, everyone. Thank you, Leon, for a very interesting talk. Especially the last part regarding art was very, very interesting for me. But I wanted to go back to something you said at the beginning of your presentation, which is might be of secondary importance when it comes to how you work. But it is very important for me. I do not work with people that are diagnosed or that identify as autists or in the spectrum, but still, I think what you said is very important because not only it sets a theoretical base from which you can understand and then intervene, but also for those of us who, even though we are not directly engaged with this kind of subjectivities, it is very important because it says a lot of how you understand language, subjectivity in itself, and of course, Lacanian theory. So it's a twofold question. First, you said you painted a picture of how alienation occurs regarding language, and you said that the autistic subject would be characterized by a refusal of a key moment of alienation in the language of the other, right? So my first question would be, are you saying that if there is any physiological divergency in neurodivergency, which is the new signifier used in almost all discourses of mental health, so-called mental health, and broader intervention upon autistic subjectivities, if there is any neurodivergency, if there is anything that could be in the nervous system, it would be a consequence, it would be secondary to this experience regarding a key moment of alienation on which the subject would be called upon to alienate itself in the signifiers that compose a language that pre-exists him or her. And the second part of my question would be, what do you mean by refusal of a subject? How can a subject at that moment, in that stage of its construction, I wouldn't use the word development, but construction, how could he or she refuse? What does that mean? Is that an act of volition? Is that how does a subject refuse that moment of alienation? I'd love if you could speak a little bit more about this. Thank you again, Leon.
Sure, and it's lovely to meet you, Juan Lu, virtually.
Equally, yeah.
Yes. So very good questions. Great, Hilda, you promised good questions.
I told you.
Okay, so let me start by saying, yes, you know, of course there is a correlation between the way one is and one behaves, and one sees the world, and one is situated in the world, and the, let's say, material composition of the brain. I think that's the case. It's I hope I don't sound silly, but it makes sense that that's the case, that the nervous system is somewhat of a the material in which the psyche is inscribed. So of course there is a divergence between among autistic people, but I think there's a divergence everywhere in this sense. The thing is that the thing that I do not engage with, not because I shun it, and again, you know, I have, as they say, some of my best friends are neuroscience. Right? They say that, right? They say, okay.
Yeah.
So it's not that I'm saying you are useless. I'm not saying that. I'm saying do what you do. Okay, I mean, your discourse has its value, but also has its blind spots. Yeah, the blind spot for that discourse is the question of the subject. But there are also blind spots for psychoanalysis, for the psychoanalytic discourse. And I think that one that is very clear, that is very strict, important even, is that psychoanalysis has nothing of the sort that we can call an etiology. It is not that we don't believe in a cause. Yeah, maybe there's a cause. I don't know. No one has been able to find it yet among the scientists that you speak about. Maybe they will find it. I don't know. That's their job. I have no idea. But in psychoanalysis, we don't concern ourselves with the question of etiology. So in this sense,
Wait, let me just
I muted.
Yeah, good, thanks.
So in this sense, psychoanalysis does not aim to cure one of their autism, as though there was a healthy subject, then there was an autism, and then we can go back to the point of a healthy subject. Psychoanalysis is situated, it begins at the moment of the subject, and the subject comes to the world as is. Whatever happens before this question, it is a religious question a little bit, huh? What is the ultimate cause? Psychoanalysis is too secular to engage with it, let's say. Again, I'm not saying that it is not an important question to be asked by others, but psychoanalysis does not ask it. We ask ourselves, oh, what is the subject? How do we work with the subject in the transference so that the subject can partake in analysis? We are not there to find a cause to reverse whatever happened to the subject, but to work with the subject in a particular way. Autism, this is what it means, basically, for me. Psychoanalytically, I think the term autism means one thing. And again, it means many things in the world. Many people use this word for many different meanings. You know, I talk about it all the time. You know, I say, oh yeah, autism also means money. It has a definition that is capital, because if you get a diagnosis of autism, at least here in Germany, you get money from the government. So if you associate with this signifier, you get money. This is one thing. Autism is an identity. Autism is something that creates communities. Autism is social capital. You know, you have celebrities that identify as being autistic just for the social capital. So autism is many things. In psychoanalysis, it means one thing. It means with this subject, I'm going to conduct an analysis in this way. So this means that autism is a coordinate within the practice of analysis. So in this sense, we don't speak about what was before and what was after. It is what it is. And then we work with it in a particular way. Today, I gave you an example. We work with it as we work with signs and not with signifiers. So if we attempt to force an autistic subject to, let's say, contextualize the tonality of a sentence, I think that is a bit senseless. It can lead to torment. I've worked with some who, in supervision that, you know, have tried to implement empathy training methods from the field of Gestalt therapy on autistic patients. that is mostly experienced as being tormenting, because the work with autism means a different type of work. So that's your first question. It's just that we don't do etiology. Yeah, we start with the subject, and the subject comes in whatever form. And this has to do with your second question about this question of the rejection, right? The rejection of the other, and this comes from two pioneering scholars in the field of Lacanian psychoanalysis and autism called Rosine and Robert Lefort, who wrote several books on this subject, sadly only in French, but maybe not a problem for many of you. And they said that in autism, there is no big other. Now, I try and translate it in several ways, and one of the ways is the way that I spoke about today. So autistic subjects don't rely on the big other as the locus of language shared by subjects in language. Subjects in culture, sorry. They access language in a different way, not through the other. I also define it as the retaining of the voice. This is another lecture. We didn't talk about it today, but it's a fascinating aspect of autism, the relationship with the voice, the relationship with enunciation. It's not a question of language. Every autistic person has a systematic construct that we call a language to understand the world, even if they don't speak at all. But many, if not most, autistic people have a certain difficult relationship with enunciation, with the voice, be it their own or be it the others. So this rejection is not only a rejection of the other, it's also a retaining of the voice. But basically, I'm saying we can view it in many different ways. But the basic idea here is that it is a certain positioning in relation to alienation. And I will go in a little rant, because I think I have 2 hours today, and that's a lot. So I'll go in a little rant. Maybe this will satisfy some other listeners. Yeah.
Okay,
Hilda?
you're going to go on the rant, as you said. Yeah, because we have like 4 more questions, but go ahead for the rant.
They will have to wait. You know, you shouldn't ask good questions. Yeah. So think about it in this way. I was speaking about the fact that human infants are half-baked. They're not ready. They're organisms that are born inherently defective. This is compared to many animals in nature that are born and are ready. They go around and they search for food. Many animals are like that. Humans are born, they can't do anything. They completely rely on the big other, on others. And this is a certain idea that there's a divide between the instinctual level. So this is the hardwired, ready-made instincts that an organism is born with in the world, right? Look at a caterpillar, look at a beetle, look at even simpler organisms. They come to their environment and their instincts are ready to survive, to do whatever they need, to get food and procreate, basically. But for humans, the instinctual level is absolutely insufficient in situating them in the humanized world. So here, I'm not even speaking about surviving in the jungle. I mean, surviving in the world of people, my God. It is very, very difficult. So the instinct is inherently lacking in its capacity to situate one in this world, right? There's a gap. I was speaking about this rupture, right? Alienation is another word for an attempt to bridge this gap. So the subject in psychoanalysis and Lacanian psychoanalysis is by itself the attempt, the attitude towards this gap. The way one attempts and fails, but attempts and supplements in a way to bridge this gap. So every type of subjectivity is a failed attempt to bridge this gap between the instinct and the humanized world. Neurotics are you know, a description for a particular failed attempt to bridge this gap. Psychosis is a name for a particular failed attempt to bridge this gap. And autism is another one, according to me, yes, and some very esteemed colleagues, that autism is a way to attempt and fail to bridge this gap. Today, I tried to describe how, through science, right? So when I speak about a choice, I don't speak about a choice like you do in the supermarket, right? It's not like, oh, will I get, I don't know, Nutella or for my pancakes, or I'll do it with, I don't know, whipped cream. I have no idea.
Canadian maple syrup.
My maple syrup, right? I always do these associations and I reveal too much in these talks, yes. Anyways, it's not this type of a choice. Lacan speaks of it as a forced choice. He gives us a metaphor. He says, look, when a person comes with a gun and points a gun to you, and he says, your money or your life, he gives you a choice. But he doesn't really give you a choice, right? You can choose your life, naturally, and you will lose your money. So you'll have to live your life without money. This is another metaphor, right? This is what we choose, right? We choose a way that will leave us always lacking. But if you choose your money, well, he's not going to give you your money. He's going to shoot you and take your money and your life. So you can't really choose your money. It's not really a choice. A subject that is alive is only a subject that chooses life and leaves money behind. So this is an idea of sort of this idea of a choice. It's not a choice between A and B. It's a choice that one makes without any other way. And again, it is not a conscious choice. It is not that there is a subject that chooses. The subject is a product, or is this choice per se. There is no moment prior. And here, if you're interested in this notion of choice, you can go to the history of philosophy and read about choice theory, and particularly about choice as spontaneity, right? I don't remember if it's Kierkegaard that was speaking about that. There's some philosophers here that might help me, but I think Kierkegaard was.
But ultimately, it's the dialectic of the master and the slave, right? He who chooses life because he's afraid to lose money is a slave.
Right. This is a Hegelian dialectics here that Lacan speaks about in terms of the forced choice. But I think it's Kierkegaard. Don't take me on that. That came to my mind. Maybe I'm wrong. But when you speak in philosophy about a choice as spontaneity, it discusses a choice where one doesn't really have any other option. Right? So this is the idea that a true choice is a choice which one makes when they have nothing else to do. It's the only thing that they can do. As I say to some people, become an academic only if this is the only thing you can do. And if you can do something else. So it's a choice in spontaneity. So again, this is how Bruno Bettelheim calls it, a spontaneous choice. And this is how Lacan calls it, a spontaneous choice, a situatedness that is completely spontaneous from the vantage point of psychoanalysis. This was my little rant.
Okay.
Great.
Yeah. And the choice also like fundamental for the existentialists, right? That we are not going to go there right now.
But they're all about the conscious choice, right? About consciousness making the choice. And this is where they diverge from psychoanalysis, right? Because we speak about an unconscious choice.
Sure. Yeah, almost like this thing. Yeah, that is forced. Hamid.
Yeah. Hi, Leon. Thank you so much for all efforts in the field of psychoanalysis. I really love your work. I have two questions. I'm not sure that they are related to each other or not, or maybe. The first is about the pseudo signifier and the signifier. I was wondering who decides that the signifier is pseudo or not pseudo, you know? Who is thinking that this is the pseudo or not, and why you are saying that one signifier could be pseudo signifier, the other not. My second question is related to alienation. you mentioned the gun, your money or your life. This gun for us, for the neurotic subject, or for the any type of subject, is this gun, can we say that this is the alienation? Can we compare it to alienation, or the gun is the alienation is the gun? Yeah. And I have an idea. I was thinking, when I was thinking about your talk, I can say it in the form of question. Does alienation into language produces excessive excitation? And this excess, or maybe we can call it surplus, the return of this excessive excitation to the subject causes the failure of the communication. The subject cannot, every time that the subject is going to, the autistic subject is going to communicate, it confronts, he confronts with this excessive excitation, I cannot manage it. Do you agree or not? Yeah. And have you ever thought about this?
Thanks, Hamid. Hilda, there's no rush. I speak with these guys all the time.
Very nice.
Yeah, so who says that? Pseudo-signifier. Simply, I say it. Jean-Claude Maleval, he says signifier. Why do I insist? Actually, because I think that it's not, it is not a devaluing judgment here. I don't think that the pseudo-signifier is less than a signifier. In a way, the signifier is pseudo. So the dispute is here and there. The reason I do it is because I insist on a distinction between two, let's say, others, two big others in the context of the signifier or the locus of signifiers, right? There is the big other, which is the place of signifiers shared by subjects in culture. People, neurotic subjects, they live in that place. They everything about themselves is in there. But if we assume that in autism there's a sort of rejection of the big other at the locus of signifiers, then I assume that even by constructing pseudo concepts, it is not that the autistic subject gains access to the big other. They create an other. They do create an other. They create an otherness. And this other, both me and Maleval call synthetic other. So it is synthetic, it is synthesized, because it is created consciously, deliberately. Now, if it is synthetic and it is not that other shared with subjects in culture, this is why I think we should distinguish between the signifier of the neurotic and the pseudo-signifier of the autistic. This is why I insist on pseudo. Pseudo is, I write about this in the paper. Pseudo is not necessarily a swear word, yes. And actually, in Lacanese, it might have some more profound meanings that might be enlightening to some of you. But I mean, read the paper. Come on.
Yeah, sure.
Here we go. So I compel you to read the paper about this traumatic moment. When someone points a gun at your head and says your money or your life, it is traumatic. I think it's a very good intuition you have there. Clearly, Lacan is insinuating it is a traumatic moment. But I would say it is not about a too much, because it can also be a too little. Right, Freud speaks about that as well. It's not necessarily something that is too much. It could also be too little. It's not about the value of the excitation. It is the mere fact of excitation, what Lacan calls jouissance. What happens then is what I think.
Since you are talking, sorry, Leon, for interrupting you. Since you are talking about the fourth choice, and the fourth choice causes you to have excitation.
Well, the fourth choice, the your money or your life, is a metaphor. It is a part of Lacan's pedagogy, right? It's not that anyone forces, like, situates a gun in your face, right? It's a metaphor for an impossible moment where there is one choice that one can only be situated within. But Lacan uses this metaphor because this metaphor also leaves you with something that you will never have, right? Something that you've lost. And I think that this moment is described by Freud as primal repression. This is what I go to great length in my book on autism to explain, right? To see what exactly is rejected. And maybe, Juan Luis, this might be interesting to you as well. So what exactly is rejected there when we speak in meta-psychological structural terms? So I go to primal repression and I really dissect it and think about what goes on in there and sort of say, well, in autism, this particular signifying unit is rejected. So I would say this moment is primal repression, and this too much, too little. Yes, it is somewhat something that Lacan calls jouissance. I think that's the case. And you're right. The question is, well, jouissance is negated, rejected, repressed, but it returns.
Yeah.
Right? So we can also distinguish the clinical structures by the way that jouissance returns. I agree.
Okay, very nice.
Thanks.
My turn.
Oh.
And it's actually very much aligned to the kind of the question that your answer is leading towards, jouissance. I want to talk a little bit about how my someone is speaking. Let's mute. Yeah, can you, Leon? You are the host, Said.
Oh, I'm the host now. Sorry.
Yes, yeah. Just
I'll mute everyone, and Hilda, you're all unmuted.
Okay. Yes.
Explain.
Yeah. So now, I wanted to talk a little bit about my experience in the clinic. I have probably a quarter of my caseload with people who are identified or diagnosed as autistic. And they are young adults or late teenagers, that sort of thing. One of them said, like, enough about the autistic child, like the autistic child grows up, right? And it's people with diverse levels of functionality and whatnot. I have found your book very, very helpful to understand this. And I'm always kind of interested about sort of the clinic of the fantasy, no? Like how the fantasy gets developed or gets constructed rather in this particular subjectivity. And sort of is this corresponding to like a delusion as in psychosis is one question. The other question that I find kind of very challenging in this clinic is precisely with this difficulty to sort of understand equivocations, for example, or sort of find in the signifier something that ciphers the jouissance. For example, when sexuality is, being circulated, for example, between a mother that is autistic and the child that is autistic, like that sort of difficulty to really bring these sort of conversations and interventions into the clinic, I find that a very important challenge that kind of demands we think outside of the usual ways. One of them has been working in tandem with another of the Lacan Salon people that is here, Chris Georgiawa. He works as a therapeutic companionship with some of these autistic subjects. And it is also like parallel to what you are presenting with regards to the art therapy. It's like bringing the dialectization in a triangle, in a social bond. So it's almost like it kind of recently we got some very kind of auspicious ways of a subject naming their jouissance in such a way that it seems to be representing themselves, you know, like writing the language. It is, yeah, an ongoing, obviously, question, but yeah, my question is a little bit about the fantasy and the jouissance. What you can say a little bit more about that?
Of course, I would benefit from a more exact request here, but yeah, I can only maybe comment on this from experience, and to the fact that, and maybe I'll engage with what you started with, I think there's a lot of conflation between diagnosis of autism today and psychosis. Not to mention autism and neurosis, in the sense that many people do their self-diagnosis or are just a bit strange and anxious and then get a diagnosis somewhere of autism. More times than not, people that come professing their autism to me in the first session go on and work on something completely different later. And in this sense, the analysis does not orient itself in any way as an analysis of autism. But in this particular context, I'll just comment in terms of the conflation with psychosis. Because there is a lot of overlap in terms of the phenomena that we do see appearing in one's behavior or speech. So there's a sort of eccentricities in the use of language, and let's say difficulties in mediating bodily experiences, experiences of depersonalization, etc. The way that Freud speaks about it, and Lacan after him, is Lacan gives us much more, but maybe we'll stay brief here, is the fact that in psychosis, repression does not operate in a sufficient way in how it operates in neurosis. It's not as efficient as it works in neurosis, and this is why we see a different type of mechanism there coming into play. This is why we see sometimes psychotic analysis coming and, you know, just recounting dreams about sleeping with their mother and killing their father, like just like that. It's not a big deal. They're able to recount it exactly as it was, where a neurotic subject will go around it for session after session until they might have a certain assumption, because repression operates there. This also says something on the level of fantasy, right? And the fact that, well, fantasy we describe in many ways, but one way that we describe it in the Lacanian orientation as this is through this formula, whatever maintains a relationship between the divided subject and the object cause of desire. And this relationship is not a direct one. Lacan says, fantasy, this is in seminar 4, page 112. I just had a discussion today with Derek about it and referred him to the page. So in seminar 4, Lacan speaks about fantasy operating like a cinema screen that plays out a scene, but the screen is frozen on a frame that is prior to the next frame, which would be impossible for the subject to encounter. It would destroy completely the efficacy of fantasy. So fantasy is something that has to keep us at a certain distance from the object cause of desire so that we won't be situated in the same place. And in psychosis, we see many times the subject situated in the place of the object cause of desire, particularly being situated as the object that the other enjoys. So if in paranoia, the big other enjoys the subject, they follow them, they have plans about their future, they want to torment them, etc., etc. So we do see these two things in autism as well. We do see subjects that are speaking about memories with their well, many times their mother, or having dreams that are extremely violent, having to do with themselves, with their close family members, and these things are recounted without any problem. Repression does not operate in the same to the same extent. And then again, yes, the subject is also the distance between the subject and the object is diluted. But the distinction that we find here, and I'll make a comment that is more practical and a comment that is more structural. I'll start with the practical because the other one slipped my mind. The practical is that autistic subject will be able to handle going down this chain of, it would be memories or signifiers, etc., without suffering from a psychotic break, right? So from my experience, we're working with psychotic subjects, one is extremely careful not to go back there to the point where the black hole was engendered in one's life, especially, let's say, in melancholia, for instance. You know, one comes to the clinic to confess, to tell a story of a man who is trash, who should die, who is actually constitutively nothing. And if the analyst just listens and goes back with the analysis through these memories, through these accounts, and gets to the point there where one commits suicide, the work is done. The analyst has heard, he has verified. So we don't go in that direction. But what I found is that for autistic subjects, and now I speak about autistic subjects that are in the clinic to think about their lives, speak about it, they do go there. And it is extremely useful for them in constructing new ideas. And we said new concepts, in reconceptualizing their framework and allowing for inconsistency in their lives. So I think this is a huge difference on the level of jouissance, right? We do see sometimes effects, particularly, and now I remember the other one, okay? We do see sometimes effects on the level of the body where one would report a certain feeling of depersonalization that could last even days, or during the session would feel something in the body. I don't know, some example, a tickling of the brain. One would start laughing. These are just from my experience, but in the analysis, the subject can handle this and actually expresses a curiosity about these events that can be extremely useful in their work. Whereas in psychosis, we will not go there. That will be a very bad sign. Yeah, for us, if we have caused the depersonalization, we would steer away from there as quickly as possible. And then about the question of jouissance and where it returns. So I said in paranoia, it returns in the other who enjoys the subject. Well, in autism, it returns, I think, in the place of the other's desire. And this was what makes it unbearable. If it is another who looks at me, who stares at me, and I see something there beyond a camera lens recording what is happening. If one is speaking to me and I hear something there behind an exact communication of meaning, this is where this is the moment where jouissance returns, and it is terrifying. And the analyst should take that into account. Should take into account that in the transference with autistic subject, one has to first become a harmless object before they become a subject that might know something. Because I think, and I'm really coining this here, but I think that while in neurosis, the analyst has to have a certain desire, the analyst's desire, in autism, that is an impossibility. So one has to first disarm the position of a desiring subject before any work can be done, before anything can be done. This can mean a certain type of speaking, a place of staring. I would even tell you that with some analysins, I have not spoken at all. We typed. There was no speaking going on. We only typed. You need to be very original here. I don't know.
I know.
There's
I
no
know. Lots of creativity there. Yeah, Leon, sorry to interrupt, but there are two questions that we have 5 minutes. We can always go 5 more minutes, but I don't want these gentlemen that are waiting to ask you some questions to go without saying thank you. Manuel.
Hello, I hope I'm visible, audible. Hi, Leon. Thank you for your talk. I have a question about the status of symbolic castration in autism, because you were talking about sort of the dialectization, the pseudo symbol, and sort of the synthetic other. And I read once a autobiography of an autistic man who's called John Elder Robinson. The autobiography is called Look Me in the Eye. And there's a very interesting little passage to me where he writes about like an experience that he has later in his life, where he looks upon his previous life that was filled with miscommunications and inabilities to understand human communication. And sort of he looks back and thinks, says like, I'm in a completely different situation right now than I was there. I would maybe like to just like read, I don't know, short sentences. So he writes, I believe a considerable rewiring took place in my own brain in my 30s and even later. I believe this because I can compare my thought processes today to my processes as experienced in writing and circuit design from 25 years ago. So he was an engineer and audio engineer. Papers I wrote back then are flat and devoid of infliction or emotion. I didn't write about my feelings because I did not understand them. Today, my greater insight into my emotional life has allowed me to express it both verbally and on paper. But there was a trade-off for that increased emotional intelligence. I looked at circuits I designed 20 years ago and it's as if someone else did them. Some of my designs were true masterpieces, but today I do not understand them anymore. So this was sort of an interesting paragraph I found where sort of this person described being much better integrated, and I don't think only on the level of masking, but better integrated into a symbolic realm that he didn't achieve before. And so my question is, what is sort of the status of symbolic castration in autism?
It's a great question, Manuel. I'd love to talk to you a little bit more later, as we don't have much time. But we can say in a way that castration is some type, well, a relationship with castration is maybe some type of a direction to any type of treatment. Right? Lacan says that renouncing some jouissance is imperative to achieve anything on the level of desire. So one has to establish a relationship with castration, even in the treatment of neurosis. This basically means because desiring is conditioned by a lack, then we have to have a place for lack in our lives. And you know, many neurotic people try and do anything in their capacity to prevent that from happening, to fill up desire, like capitalism tells us, with products, with objects, with ideas, with words. And let's say analysis leads to a point where lack is let's say less squeezed by the many signifiers that are imposed on us by ourselves and by others. This is something similar in autism. I think the goal, the direction of the treatment is to establish a lack. Yeah, but the difference is that this lack will exist within a domain of signs rather than a domain of signifiers. So it's a different question. But then we're aiming at, yes, at a relationship with castration, at establishing castration at a certain level. We can use this term, and it's interesting you're using it, Manuel, because I've never thought about it in this context. But we might say that it is a castration that establishes itself within a domain of signs. The point is, the work in analysis is not about creating an excess of signs, an excess of explanations, an excess of knowledge, an excess of understanding. On the contrary, it is about creating a place where there is nothing. But one does something with it. One deploys it in their lives in a meaningful way, and it's the same in autism. But let's talk about it a bit more when we meet very soon.
Wonderful. And finally, Bryce, who is going to read his question that put in the chat. Bryce? Hello? Oh, well,
you are muted, Bryce. You have to mute yourself.
Bryce, yeah, here. Yeah.
Probably on the phone, it takes a little more time. The Zoom app is a bit complex on the phone, I think.
Yes, and maybe we can help him on muting. Oh, but
I try to ask him to unmute, but we cannot force one.
Wow, here, yeah, no, I cannot. As to unmute, yeah, that's right. Okay, so if he is unable to do it, I can read his question. That is,
if he's not here, there's no point, huh?
He's there. He's there. It's just that he's unable to do the.
Hey, can you hear me?
Oh, here's Bryce.
My apologies. The permissions on my phone weren't set up appropriately. So let me.
You're muted again, Bryce.
Yeah.
Here we go.
There it is. Okay, so the question in the chat, I actually ended up answering when I checked your paper. It was in regards to the categories that you had with reference to the sort of differences between the sign and the signifier, the flexibility, intersubjectivity, so on. But I did have a general question about if your experience in analysis with autistic people, if you've had any experience with nonverbal autism, which is, I guess, how does psychoanalysis look in that sort of analyst-analyst-and relationship? I wonder, because it's what I concern myself a lot with as a ESE teacher. So my the curriculum or the expectation, my job is often pedagogy. But as you say, I feel like reliance on psychoanalytic sort of inquiry, investigation, and intervention is often what it is most fruitful in my relationship with them and what I'm able to sort of get them to express. I had one client, this is in reference to when you're talking about how the signifier is phonological, like the development of that language is first and foremost somewhat auditory or, phonological sound without meaning. So my student is nonverbal and he has a general sort of command, I'd say probably first, second grade level aptitude, which has unfortunately been highly structured and influenced by PECs throughout his whole career. He's 20 years old, but he's nonverbal and he can write some for basic wants, needs. And I've been able to sort of flesh out or encourage some writings that are a bit more abstract. Perhaps they would have called it word salad years ago, but I think upon closer inspection, there's a lot of interesting things that he's working with in that sort of writing. But anyways, he's still very vocal, despite not sort of bridging that link between phonemes and sort of relating to language in that phonological signifier sort of way. So I just wondered if there was something to that, that there isn't necessarily a specificity or deficit in relation to the phonological when relating to signification in that way, because he's extremely rhythmic, uses beat gestures almost gutturally with his voice when we're interacting with gestures, or we do some sign language and things like that. And also, okay, so there's not really a question there other than the phonological bit. But I do say that I fully agree, not like you need my agreement, but with the notion of presenting yourself as an object, in a harmless object in relationship to, in my experience, nonverbal severe autistic cases, because there is a suspicion there. The desire behind my eyes, my expectations, is especially loaded as a teacher to him, because he's been through classroom, and what teacher signifies for him, or the referent, is usually forced compliance, hex, a sort of lack of understanding. But it's difficult to do that, especially in his case. He was very self-injurious for a while, and you're often kind of the soundboard that receives some of that injury as well, until you can find a sort of healthy outlet for it. So it plays out a little differently, but I do think, like in your case of analyst-analyst relationship being harmless, you have to do the same thing, even within the pedagogical setting, although it's incredibly difficult. But I was just happy to hear that you shared that, because I think it's pivotal.
Thank you, Bryce. And please feel free to contact me if you want to develop this case. I'm looking for people who work with, as you said, non-verbal autistic people.
Yes.
And if you feel these intuitions speak to you, it would be nice. So you can ask Hilda for my email, or you can contact me through my website.
Okay.
I'll just say very briefly, Lacan didn't say many things about autism, but one thing that he said is that autistic people are rather verbose. This is what he said. And that's very true. They're verbose, but they're not verbal. This is a different thing. Verbal would be an utterance that is, through the interaction between sounds, one aims to convey meaning. And I suggest you open YouTube and you see a clip called "In Our Language" by Amanda Baggs, and she speaks about this verbosity, I think, in the most exact way. And she's a nonverbal autistic person. And I'll just say that, just quickly say, and we'll end here, that yes, in autism, in the first stage, one has to provide an environment where language can be used in a useful way. So one first discovers that an utterance can manipulate the world in a way that is useful for them. This is on a very basic level. Then one discovers the joy of speaking. There's a joy, a pleasure, a satisfaction that's produced from the act of speaking alone, even if it is speaking about something like a special interest, speaking about trains, combining a knowledge that is based on speech, on a language. And only after that can one think about using language in the aim of change, of this more psychoanalytic effect that we speak about, what I think Manuel was speaking about in his example. So yeah, the use of language can be deciphered on these levels, and one would go from one to the other, but that will not necessarily engage with one in preceding stages. But that's very briefly. But yeah, again, I'm honestly would love to hear from you. So please get in touch.
Okay, for sure. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much, Leon, for your generous sort of responding to each question, for being here. It has been a pleasure. Bravo.
Thank you.
We will have this video very soon and let you all know about it. Thank you so much.
Fantastic. Thank you, everybody.
Thank
it
you
was
so
a
much.
pleasure. Until next time.
Until next
Yeah.
time.
Thank you, Leon. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Bye. Thank you, everyone.